Tornadoes now being confirmed amid severe weather in the Midwest. Over 400,000 homes and businesses were without power last night, from Minnesota to Michigan. For more news with a Catholic perspective, visit EWTNnews.com. I'm Teresa Tomeo, and Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders starts now.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
Why do Catholics worship Mary?
What's stopping you?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest? Where is purgatory in the Bible?
What's stopping you?
I think the Pope has too much authority.
What's stopping you? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN. Delighted to have you with us. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you have a question about the Catholic faith, we are here to get that question answered. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Outside North America, please dial 1 and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 58177. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply for some folks. Also, if you're watching us on TV today, best way for you to contact the show is through email, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Pedro Quiles, our producer, Matt Kabinski as our phone screener, Rich Jesse handling social media for us. If you'd like to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, streaming on both those platforms right now, just put your question in the comments box if you would. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
I am well. Are you doing okay today?
Yeah, I'm doing decent. Thank you very much.
Glad to hear it. We're going to lead off with this emailed question from Bert. What is the difference between the Holy Spirit and the Holy Ghost, and is one term improper to use over the other?
Yeah, the only difference is that one term has Latinate origins and the other one Germanic origins.
Really?
Right, yeah, Geist, of course, in German means soul or spirit.
Geist, okay.
Right? And so that's where you get the older English ghost.
Yeah.
But it means it's a synonym.
Okay.
Right, it's a synonym. Although it would seem rather odd to have a cartoon about Casper the Spirit, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and stick with the ghost.
Yeah.
Okay. Bert, thanks so much for your email. Here's one from Tom. Is there a good way to discern religious priesthood or diocesan priesthood?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for the question. So, if you enter a religious order, unless it is a religious order of priests, and there are such things.
There are.
There is no guarantee that you'll be ordained. So let's say you want to go become a Dominican or Franciscan for that matter. All right. Well, you might get ordained, and a lot of them do. But your superiors will decide, not you. And they will say, well, we think you're good for religious life, but you have a vocation to religious life, but we think you don't have what it takes to be a priest. So we're not going to ordain you. You're going to stay a lay brother for your entire life as a religious. So you don't discern priesthood first when that question comes up. You discern religious life. Do you discern religious life? So, I'll tell you, our EWTN's very own Father John Paul. I mean, I've talked to him a lot about his vocation over the years, and he was in the diocesan seminary, and he's told me, he said, I discerned that I needed to live in a religious community. That was essential for my spiritual path, my life of holiness. I needed the support of a religious community and a rule of life, right? And the Franciscan thing was exactly what I needed, right? So I discerned religious life as something separate from discerning priesthood, right? So, if what you are ultimately motivated by is, like, my number one concern is to serve the people of God by offering the sacraments. That's my motive, right? There's no doubt that the need is greatest in the diocesan priesthood. Sure. There's a huge shortage in the West of diocesan priests, so that's where the need is. So that's, and then if you do discern religious life, it's important to discern the particular charism of religious life. I mean, I know a priest, he actually passed this past year tragically, God have mercy on his soul, who began as a Franciscan And he knew he wanted to be religious, so he began as a Franciscan. And he was sent to Rome to study at the Angelicum, which is a Dominican institution. And he said to me, I realized at that moment that I had not a Franciscan bone in my body. And that I was right to discern religious life, but I had been wrong to discern Franciscan religious life. I was a Dominican through and through.
Yeah.
And so he changed, and he became a Dominican. And he actually ended up, for reasons that had nothing to do with his vocation, but had everything to do with like his family life, he ended up in diocesan priesthood, but he died a third-order Dominican, right? So these are some of the things you would want to consider. And ultimately, I asked my own Bishop Robert Baker, former bishop, how did you know you were called to the priesthood? And he gave me the best answer I've ever heard. He said, I knew I was called to the priesthood when my bishop ordained me.
Wow. That is so cool.
Yeah.
Tom, thanks so much for your email. Here's one more from Marie. How did we get from kneeling at the altar to now standing in line?
So that was a change that came in after the reform of the liturgy after the Second Vatican Council. And kneeling at the altar is not the required posture anymore in the rubrics of the Mass.
Okay, leave it at that. Marie, thanks for your email. And one more here from Helen. If a person has a problem with alcohol, can grape juice be used as a replacement for wine in the Mass?
Nope, cannot. Now there is an Episcopal exception. The bishop can grant a dispensation from wine, but not in favor of grape juice. You can actually substitute mustum, which is like it's wine at the very first stages of fermentation, so that the alcohol content is very low. But there has to be some fermentation. It cannot just be grape juice. That's not wine. That's not valid matter.
Okay, very good. Helen, thank you so much for your email. And if you would like to send us an email for a future show, here's the address, ctc@ewtn.com. ctc@ewtn.com. We try to do 2 or 3, sometimes even 4 emails at the beginning of our show, Monday through Friday on radio. And then once a month or so, we will dip into the mailbag and do a whole bunch of emails. But the address, ctc@ewtn.com. We're going to get to the phones in just a moment here. We're going to begin with Stephanie in Houston, and hopefully you as well. 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, or maybe you'd like to explain to us what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic. Maybe you've been thinking about it, praying about it, and you're thinking, the Catholic Church makes sense for me, but there's this one thing. What is that one thing? Let's talk about it. 833-288-3986. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Stay with us.
The EWTN radio listener comment line is open right now for you. If you've got a question or comment about what you hear on EWTN radio, we'd love to hear it. Call 205-795-5773. We'd also like to know how our programming has impacted your life or the life of someone you know. That number again, 205-795-5773. And thank you for listening to EWTN Radio.
Hi, this is Father Mike Schmitz. Please join me for Ascension's Bible in a Year and Catechism in a Year here on EWTN Radio. We're going through the entire Bible and the Catechism in 365 days. If you've ever wanted to understand what it means to be Catholic and allow those truths to shape your life, this is for you.
Bible in a Year and Catechism in a Year with Father Mike Schmitz, tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific on EWTN Radio.
Discover the beauty, truth, and goodness of the Church. With the EWTN online learning series, you can delve into the riches of the faith and grow closer to the Lord with free videos and study guides. Enroll in the EWTN online learning series free courses today at learningseries.ewtn.com.
It's called Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Our phone number, 833-288-3986. A quick shout out here to our phone screener, Vanessa. Vanessa Sanchez will be doing the call screening today. So that's who you'll be hearing when you call 833-288-3986. Let me tell you about something beautiful before we go to the phones here. It is a personalized desk shrine commemorating the marriage of St. Joseph and Mary. This desk shrine is a perfect meditative and devotional gift for perhaps a wedding or an anniversary or another special occasion. The lovely image shows Mary and Joseph kneeling before the priest who blesses them both in marriage. The image is digitally printed onto a wood plaque. It's inset in an elegant white marble shrine that is made of stone-cast alabaster. The shrine is 5.5 inches wide, 8 inches high, 1.5 inches deep, not too big for you. The back of the shrine features a secured easel for standing, or if you prefer, a simple metal hook for hanging. How about this? A personalized desk shrine commemorating the marriage of St. Joseph and Mary. It's available now at EWTNRC.com. Go there and check it out. Put in desk shrine in the search box. I'm sure you'll see it. EWTNRC.com. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN, beginning with Stephanie, a first-time caller from Houston, listening on her Alexa device. Hello, Stephanie. What's on your mind today?
Well, I was just wondering what your thoughts are on attending a Ukrainian Catholic Church Mass just to get an experience of their liturgy. My husband said he thought it wasn't a good idea, but I just wanted to get your thoughts.
Oh, thank you. Well, with all due respect to your husband, I think you should absolutely go attend a Ukrainian Catholic liturgy and all the Eastern Catholic liturgies that you can visit. And I see you're calling from Houston. A city that size is going to have a lot of different Catholic rites represented, and I think you ought to go on a little liturgy tour and see them all. Pope Leo I love saying that. I still can't get over saying that.
I know.
Pope Leo just gave an address to the Eastern Catholic churches saying, the church needs you. The church needs you, right? And he was echoing Pope Francis, right? This is, yes. They are, Pope John Paul II said that the church breathes with two lungs, East and West, and that the Eastern patrimony is an essential part of the Catholic patrimony, and we in the West should absolutely avail ourselves of the spiritual riches of the Eastern Church. I mean, just imagine if you had, my mother grew up with two sides of her family, father's side, mother's side. Mother's side was all in the South, and they lived in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Father's side was all in Pennsylvania. And her mom didn't get along great with her husband's relatives.
Uh-huh.
So my mother grew up not really knowing her cousins very well. She knew some of the cousins on her mother's side, didn't really know as she called them, the Yankee cousins all that well, right? And when she grew up, she said, you know what? I want to get to know them Yankee cousins. And lo and behold, she's gotten to be very close with them, and they've enriched her life tremendously. They've come to visit and so forth. And I got to meet the Yankee cousins too, right? Well, we have the equivalent of the Yankee cousins, right? We've got all these wonderful Catholics from the East that have wonderful traditions and wonderful insights that are different from ours. We have good stuff. They have good stuff. And we need to mutually enrich one another. So I think it is a fantastic idea. And, of course, that fulfills your Sunday obligation if you go on a Sunday.
Sure.
You're required to attend the sacred liturgy in a Catholic rite. That is the only thing that's required to fulfill your Sunday obligation. And who knows? You might go over there and say, hey, I really like hanging out with these Ukrainian Catholic types and visit the Ukrainians, visit the Ruthenians, visit all the ones that you can visit. Right.
And like you say, a city the size of Houston is going to have some choices there for you.
It's going to have a bunch. I have some friends that are, I have friends from a lot of different Catholic rites. I have some friends that are Syro-Malabar, which is an Indian rite.
Yes.
And I went to one of their events one time and went and had lunch with them afterwards. And I'm a big fan of Indian food, and it was it was all home cooked Indian food.
Oh, fantastic.
But I do need my fork and spoon.
Yeah.
Right. They don't do forks and spoons. They don't do utensils in authentic Indian. So it's like, here, have some naan and a placemat and wash your hands before you eat.
Off you go.
Off you go.
Stephanie, thanks so much for your call today. And that opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. Calls are coming in, but there's room for you at 833-288-3986. 833-288-3986 for Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Here's a question from Carl. If Catholics don't have access to a priest and the sacraments, are they culpable for not attending Mass and receiving the sacraments?
No, of course not. You cannot. You're not at fault for something over which you have no control.
Okay.
Right. And if it is not physically or morally possible for you to attend a Mass or receive the sacraments, then you cannot be required to do what it is impossible for you to do. It's a principle of Catholic moral theology that God doesn't expect or demand the impossible. If it's commanded, it's possible. If it isn't possible, it isn't commanded.
Love common sense.
Yep.
There you go. And thanks so much for your email. Here's a call now from Rose Marie, a first-time caller from Billings, Montana, listening on the great Billings Catholic Radio. Hey, Rose Marie, what's on your mind today?
Oh, thank you for taking my call. And I would like, please, for Dr. Anders to explain to me what Christian Science is. I know how it was Mary Baker Eddy, and I've been close to an elderly lady who is was a Christian Scientist. And would you please explain, Dr. Anders, and let me connect the dots, please?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. So I have to confess that I'm not an expert in the thought of Mary Baker Eddy or the Christian Science tradition, but it isn't science. I'll tell you that right now. It's not science.
Okay.
And it's not historic Christianity either, right? So it's a little bit of a misnomer in the title. And, in their theology, it has some similarities to ancient Gnostic sects that believed that Jesus' principal significance was a bringer of esoteric wisdom, and that by the mere fact of assimilating that wisdom, one could be freed from one's bodily enslavement and go to kinder realms after death. And there's elements of that in the Christian Science tradition, in that they teach, among other things, that, say, physical illness and death are illusions. Mm-hmm. And so coming to recognize that they're illusions, one is no longer subject to them. And they took that sufficiently seriously that when Mary Baker Eddy died, that many of her followers refused to believe it.
Really?
Because, she wasn't going to die, right? Because she had overcome death by understanding that it was an illusion. Well, she died, right? And I assure you that if you were to take a survey, you would find that the average Christian Scientist has the same rates of disease and life expectancy as anybody in the general population, right? There actually are some exceptions. There are some religious communities that have longer life expectancies because they eat healthy and exercise as part of their rule of life.
Sure.
They eat healthy and exercise. I think but Christian Science, I think, is since their philosophy on longevity is thinking that you're not going to die, that doesn't actually have any clinical benefit.
Sure. Rosemarie, thanks so much for your call today from Billings, Montana. Good to hear from you. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Still time for your phone calls at 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. Here's a question now from Ben in Rapid City. A bit of a deep dive on this one. What are the Christus Victor and the satisfaction theories of the Atonement? What are they? And which one, if either, describes the Catholic Church's doctrine?
Yeah, thanks. Well, first of all, both of them are Catholic.
Okay.
Both of them are Catholic. Christus Victor is the name that the Swedish Lutheran theologian Gustaf Åhlén gave to describe a model of the atonement that was common in Christian antiquity, particularly among the Cappadocian fathers, that saw the significance of Christ's ministry, that he had conquered the evil powers of sin, death, hell, and the devil. And the harrowing of hell, Christ's descent to the dead and resurrection on the third day, are presented as a kind of direct confrontation with the jaws of death, as it were, and sort of rending death and freeing the human race from its slavery to sin and death. That image of Christ as a conquering hero is what's put forth as the main idea in what Åhlén called the Christus Victor, Christ the Victor view. I don't think the fathers used that name for it. That was something that Olaine put on it, but it's stuck because it was vivid and accurate, right? The satisfaction view of the atonement is most clearly articulated by Anselm of Canterbury, the 11th century scholastic theologian, often seen as the progenitor of the Catholic scholastic tradition. And it is based on the idea that the death of Christ is a sacrifice that makes reparation to God for offenses against His honor, right? And of course that it's drawn. The imagery there is drawn from the sacrificial language that's applied to the death of Christ in sacred Scripture. Paul explicitly calls the death of Christ a sacrifice of atonement. And even though Anselm is the first thinker to fully articulate it, I think that it is implied in the structure of the Church's liturgy, which has always presented the consecrated elements to God as a sacrifice and asked Him to look favorably upon our sacrifice and to give us mercy and so forth. The Christus Victor view is also represented in sacred Scripture in a number of places, particularly in the Gospel of Mark. Right, Mark is the gospel where the death of Christ is really portrayed with cosmic significance, when the sun is darkened and everything is blackened in the death of Christ, and so much of the gospel is about Jesus' direct confrontation with evil, whether demonic possession or sickness or death, and then He ultimately succumbs to that, but then breaks victoriously free at the end. So. And there's a lot of that in St. Paul and in the later epistles like Ephesians and Colossians about, Christ being in confrontation with the spirit of this age or the gods of this age, that sort of thing. So both images are biblical, and there are other biblical images of the atonement as well. I mean, Peter, in his epistle, says that Christ died to leave us an example, the so-called moral influence theory of the atonement. Well, that's also biblical, right? So there, you find any number of ways of depicting the death of Christ in sacred Scripture, and different fathers, different theologians will latch on to one or the other of those. The one common theory of the atonement that's not biblical and not Catholic is the penal substitution theory that's associated with Calvinism. That's not a Catholic theory. But those others are all found in the Catholic tradition.
Very good. Ben in Rapid City, thanks so much for your question today. Call to communion here on EWTN. Back to the phones now at 833-288-EWTN. Here is Charles in San Diego, listening on the great JP2 Catholic Radio. Hey, Charles, what's on your mind today, sir?
I'd like to know what year was the Great Flood.
Yeah, thank you. So personally, I don't believe that the biblical flood of Noah was an historical event. Right? I think that it's a literary event that we as Christians are supposed to take as an allegory for Christian baptism. That's explicitly what St. Peter says in chapter 3 of his epistle. He speaks about the flood as an allegory of Christian baptism. And I'm not a scientist, I'm not a geologist or the son of one. I did take one course in geology in college, however.
Did you?
Yes. And I enjoyed it a lot, and I've forgotten most of what I learned, except that I thought sea stacks were pretty cool. I remember that. Right?
Sea stacks,
yeah.
Okay.
And gypsum. I think the mineral called gypsum. That was pretty neat, too.
Okay.
But I don't remember much else from geology.
All right.
But my understanding is that the geological record shows no evidence of a worldwide flood. In fact, quite the contrary, right? So I don't think there's a good scientific reason to hold that. And I don't think there's a good reason to hold it from the point of view of biblical narrative either, right? I mean, the Scriptures don't present themselves as a geological history of the planet. And the purpose of the flood narrative is to make a moral point rather than an historical one. Now, there are people who in the history of the tradition have wanted to read the Bible at every level as a literal historical narrative. One of the most famous was the Anglican Bishop James Ussher, who is reputed for having sort of worked out what he thought was a biblical chronology that placed I think he had the world starting about 4000 BC, something like that, and so the flood would have come shortly thereafter. But he's not taken seriously either by biblical scholars today or by scientists. So I think the question presupposes a category mistake.
Okay. Hey, Charles, thanks so much for checking in from San Diego. Call to communion here on EWTN. Quick question from Eugenia. Do we consider priests the 70 disciples whom Jesus appointed and sent 2 by 2 to every town and place where he was about to come in Luke 10:1?
That's a really good question. So, I mean, clearly the apostles, the 12, were ordained as priests. Were every one of the 70? Well, he sent the 70 out before he created the sacred priesthood. Because the priesthood dates from the upper room, right? That's why we celebrate the Holy Thursday during Holy Week.
Yes,
is the Mass of the Lord's Supper is the Mass that celebrates the institution of the priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
So they were apostles with the lowercase a, right? In the sense that to be sent is to be an apostle, right? Whether they would have subsequently been ordained as priests, I'm sure some of them must have been. But they weren't at the time because the apostles themselves hadn't been ordained to the Christian priesthood at that time.
Okay. Eugenia, thanks so much for your email. We'll get back to the phones in just a moment here. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you prefer, text the letters EWTN to 58177. And if you're watching us on TV, send us an email, ctc@EWTN.com. Back in a moment with lots more Call to Communion here on EWTN.
The power of prayer depends on God's action, not on our praying. The Holy Spirit prays within us with groanings too deep for words, as Romans 8 says. And He empowers us to seek God and to seek from Him all that we need. And the answer to prayers are always from God in order to worship Him.
This is a Messy Family Minute with Mike and Alicia Hernan. 3 years ago, we became grandparents, and it's just as wonderful as everyone told us it would be. We are blessed to have the love of 5 grandchildren, and we look forward to many more.
Grandparents are a blessing to children because they have a different perspective on life in general. We can usually see the problems that toddlers or teenagers have with different eyes than their parents. We have more time to pray for them and more time to serve. Our very lives dedicated to God and to our vocation is a witness to the joy of living the gospel. But what is the role of a grandparent in the life of a grandchild?
The best thing a grandparent can do is boldly love. Love your grandchildren deeply, and by doing so, you will be an image of God's love for them. Love your adult children by supporting them, even if they choose to raise their children differently than you raised them. Parents are the most powerful influence in the life of a child, and you, as a grandparent, need to build up that relationship between your child and your grandchild. For more inspiration and encouragement, visit us at messyfamilyminute.org.
Join EWTN for the inauguration Mass of Pope Leo XIV from St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Sunday morning, 3 Eastern on EWTN television and radio.
Matt Swaim here. Monday on the Sunrise Morning Show, we'll share highlights from Sunday's formal installation of Pope Leo XIV and get you all the latest news, weather, sports, and more. Now back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Glad you're with us for Call to Communion here on EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, we'd love to chat with you. 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Congratulations going out to another great EWTN radio partner. That would be the great Catholic Radio Network. With 20 stations serving Missouri, Kansas, and Colorado, they are celebrating 21 years with EWTN. Congratulations to Jim O'Laughlin, his great team there at Catholic Radio Network, from your friends here at EWTN. All right, back to the phones now, and we're going to go, well, not quite. We're not quite ready with some of these calls, but let me do this email here before we get to the calls. And this is from Tommy. Dr. Anders, I saw that the new Pope, Pope Leo, said he chose his name because of the new industrial revolution in which the church must restate human dignity because of the potential for AI, much like Leo XIII had to with Rerum Novarum. What are some of the concerns the Holy Father might have with AI?
Well, I don't know what his specific concerns are with artificial intelligence. I don't know that, but so I don't want to speak on his behalf.
Okay, sure.
I can speculate. There are some technology prognosticators that think that we're all going to be AI'd out of a job, right? Now,
Mhm.
you know, I mean, it seems to me there are going to be some things that you can't AI away. I mean, when my air conditioner breaks, you know, I'm not going to bring an AI in, I think, to fix it. You know, I mean, some of that may become roboticized to a certain extent, but, you know, there's a lot of things that could be AI'd away. So it'll be disruptive to the economy, that's for sure. The other thing about artificial intelligence is, and social networking in general, it has a tremendous power and capacity to affect the way people think. People are extremely suggestive, very suggestive, and they're much more subject to groupthink than they think they are. And I actually listened to a podcast recently. And of course, I'm way out of my league here. I'm a theologian. I don't know anything about technology. But it was with a fellow who had been at the forefront of developing the direct-to-video marketing industry.
Oh, okay.
And he made a lot of money doing it, but he has repented of his efforts, right? Because his thinking was applied to politics. He thought that the use of artificial intelligence and direct-to-video marketing would create better democracy because instead of letting politicians define the spin and then manipulating people into their way of thinking, they could use artificial intelligence to figure out what people's actual concerns were and then inform politicians who could tailor their messages to meet the demand rather than the other way around. So his initial thought, which he later repented of as naive, was that using this technology will help further democracy. The reason he repented of it is, at the end of the day, what he found was that what it did is it actually deepened the most powerful motivator is fear.
Sure.
And so the amount of data that is available on individuals through their use of social media and their telephones, everything is just massive. It's just massive. And there are companies that just do nothing but pay billions to acquire every piece of information about you from cradle to grave. And they're really, really good at reading your mind, as it were. I mean, they have literally read your mail. Literally read your mail. And then they can tailor artificially intelligently created media content that is directly targeting your deepest fears and anxieties, and foment narratives about the state of the world that are designed manipulatively to play upon those fears in order to sell you a solution, right? And in the political sphere, what that may very well be directly implicated in the tremendous rise in divisive ideological thinking and xenophobia and sort of conflict-ridden politics as opposed to consensus building, which seems to be the pattern around the world today, right?
Yeah.
So there are some significant threats to human dignity and to the solidarity of the human family, I think, that are posed by the technology today.
Pretty fascinating stuff. Thanks so much for your email. Now we're ready to go to the phones. Here is Sister Cheryl in Phoenix watching us on YouTube today. Hey, Sister, what's on your mind today?
This is regarding the ring that the Pope wears, that he wears that ring to seal documents with. Now, I understand that they took it off of him and destroyed it. Instead of destroying it, and it's going to be impossible for anybody else to use that ring since he'll be entombed in so many, at least around 3 layers of coffins and everything. Why couldn't they have left it on, the ring on Pope Francis, and let him be buried with it?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. I have to tell you that Vatican protocol is not my strong suit. And I once picked up a book on Vatican protocol, and it was a rather hefty book.
I'll bet.
And of course, you know, the papacy, being a very ancient monarchy and an ancient institution, is replete with tradition. And you know, sometimes the thing with tradition is that the intelligibility, the rationale for it, is lost in ages past. But we do it this way because we've always done it this way.
Yeah.
You know, that's a lot of how tradition functions. And, you know, this is pure speculation on my part. Of course, I'm not, because like I said, I think I've been in the Vatican museums. You know, I've been to Mass in St. Peter's. That's about as good as I get. I mean, I know very little about the inner workings of the Holy See. It's not necessary for my Catholic life, and it's not what generally keeps people from becoming a Catholic. But I can certainly imagine a situation where you would want to, if a papal seal would render a particular document, a certain kind of legal force that would become binding, that you would want to ensure that nobody could fraudulently produce a document in the Pope's name. Right.
Okay.
Now, granted, there are other ways of ensuring that today. We no longer, the seal of the ring is a kind of formality from ages past. There was probably a day when that was more important. And, before social media and before telephones, the Pope sends a message, might take months to get there. How are you going to verify it? Oh, here it's got the papal seal on it. Must be legit. So,
Fascinating. Sister Cheryl, thanks so much for your call today from Phoenix. Call to communion here on EWTN. Let's go to Marianne now in San Antonio, listening on the EWTN app. Hey, Marianne, what's on your mind today?
Who? Are you taking Marianne's call?
Yes, go right ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I switched it from speakerphone. Okay, I'm not sure where I came in when the guy was talking about the Noah's Ark, and you told him that it was more of a I think you said more of a story than of a actual happening. Am I right?
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so my question is, well, it's not a question. When I was married, or my ex-husband said that he saw documentaries on the Noah's Ark being found.
Sure.
Parts of it, all of it, I'm not real sure.
Sure.
So how does that tie in with everything?
Yeah, thanks.
Is that true too?
Sure. I'm perfectly aware of these documentaries. I know all about them. So, first of all, let me explain the difference between the Catholic view of the Bible and the fundamentalist view of the Bible. Fundamentalism, as a species of Protestantism, takes the view that the Bible is literally true in all of its propositions, that the purpose of the Bible is to give us a list of true propositions, and that systematic theology is the task of assembling those propositions into some kind of coherent order, and that once you've done that, voila, you've done theology. And if you're putting together, say some sort of you've got to have some particular kind of chemical bond for an engineering process. Missing a step could be devastating. Like the wing's going to fall off the airplane if you don't get that one chemical bond right. You got to have all the ingredients. And that's kind of how the fundamentalist sees the Bible, right? That you have to have all the pieces lined up just perfectly jigsaw-like. And if you have one missing, then you're going to miss something essential and your faith is going to fall apart and you're going to be lost, right? And that's just not the way. And by the way, I should add that view of the Bible is very modern. It's very modern. It's a feature of 19th century Protestantism, and it owes more to the dialogue with Baconian science than it does to history or to the Bible itself, right? And I say that because when you look at the Bible doesn't present itself as that kind of a thing, right? I mean, Jesus clearly doesn't view the Bible that way. St. Paul doesn't view the Bible that way. There are several instances in the New Testament when Jesus takes the literal words of the Old Testament and says, I don't think so, right? I mean, take a couple of examples. When the Pharisees asked Jesus if it's lawful for a man to divorce his wife, well, the book of Deuteronomy says, yes, it's lawful for a man to divorce his wife. And Jesus says, no, it's not lawful. He just flat out contradicts what the Old Testament says. And they, well, where do you get off, Jesus, saying that you can't divorce your wife when Moses says otherwise? And Christ says, well, Moses said that because of the hardness of your heart. But it wasn't like that from the beginning. So he imports an interpretive principle that's not presented by the Bible itself. And St. Paul does the same thing. Another one would be Jesus in John chapter 8. A woman caught in adultery. Law of Moses, I think it's chapter 22, says, stone her.
Yeah.
Pharisees come and say, Jesus, law of Moses says, stone this woman. What do you say? Well, you know the end of the story. He refuses to carry out the execution. He just says, no, we're not going to do that. Well, what about the law of Moses? Like I said, we're not going to do that. And that's why St. Paul, writing in 2 Corinthians, says that the mere letter of the Old Testament leads to death, because quite literally it called for death. But seen through the mind of Christ, seen through the lens of Jesus, it's the Spirit that gives life. And so hence is born the Catholic understanding that the proper way to read the Old Testament is for the spiritual sense. The literal sense has a value, but it's primarily as sort of the bedrock out of which the spiritual sense grows. And that's, how do I use the Bible to grow closer to Christ and to God? St. Augustine, in his book on biblical hermeneutics, said that any interpretation of Scripture is valid, provided it leads to charity, to actual love and the virtues. And so this is the way Catholics use the Bible. It's very different from the way the fundamentalist does. And so when the New Testament looks at the flood of Noah, St. Peter says the flood of Noah is an allegory to represent Christian baptism. Because what happens in the flood of Noah? Well, impurity is washed away. That's the point of the story.
Right.
Or at least a point. And he says that's what we want to do in our own lives. We want to wash away impurity, and the sacraments are how we do that, right? And we want to grow in holiness. That's how we approach it. Now, because fundamentalists don't see it that way, because they put such a priority on the literal words being literally true, they are motivated to propagandize that and to provide so-called evidences for it. And there is a massive industry within fundamentalism of what's called evidentialist apologetics, which is a very tendentious, very biased, very prejudicial use of I don't want to call it science, but of, natural facts and phenomena to try to marshal a defense of their worldview. And sometimes it borders on outright fraud. Sometimes, and often it does. Sometimes it's just ignorance. Sometimes it's outright fraud. I grew up as a fundamentalist in that community before I became Catholic, and so I'm familiar with this industry. And I have seen, personally witnessed, cases of outright fraud when people produce, what are taken to be clear evidences of biblical narrative. Like, I'm not going to name names, but I know of a fundamentalist filmmaker who Jacques Cousteau style claims to have dived down in the Dead Sea and pulled up the wheels of Egyptian chariots.
Oh, my.
Right? And he's got them on film. Here they are, Egyptian chariot wheels. Well, it's a fraud. They're not real Egyptian chariot wheels. Like, he didn't do this. He's lying, right? And yes, I grew up in a community where people who had the money and resources wanted to marshal expeditions to Mount Ararat in Turkey to go look for the remains of the ark because they were so certain that it was there. And they love to come back with photographs of some bulge in the side of a mountain someplace that this has got to be Noah's Ark and all this kind of business. And so I'm aware of that. I'm just not persuaded by it, right? And neither is the sort of the world body of geologists or archaeologists, for that matter, right? The scientific consensus on this is pretty clear that there's just no evidence of a worldwide flood. And I think in academic journals of archaeology, you're going to find a dearth of articles that are, peer-reviewed works on carbon dating the remains of the big boat that they found on top of Mount Ararat in Turkey. You're just not going to find that kind of evidence. You are going to find it, however, in the VHS tapes of 1970s fundamentalists who've been bandying this stuff about for years to try to indoctrinate, junior high students in their Christian schools. That's where I got it.
All right. And Marianne, thank you so much for your call today from San Antonio. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Try to answer as many questions as we can. Here is Bob, a first-time caller on Long Island, listening on Sirius XM, channel 130. Hey there, Bob. What's on your mind today?
Hey, how you doing today? Hope you're having a blessed.
Thank you.
You were just speaking about disciples, the 70 apostles that were sent out.
Yeah.
I was always taught that it was 70 disciples that were sent out and that there were 25 apostles.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So I think I qualified when I made that remark. I said apostles with a small a. Right? So in the technical sense, the apostles with a capital A is a specific office in the church that is limited to the 12.
Okay.
And it's not repeated. So nobody else is an apostle in that sense. So when we read about the church being founded upon the bedrock of the prophets and the apostles, we're talking about the 12. Okay. Paul referred to them as those reputed to be pillars, right? But there are other passages of the New Testament where, Paul will refer to someone as outstanding among the apostles, and they're clearly not one of the 12. And, they're local characters in the ancient church that had a mission that they carried out in the name of the church. And that is, the laying out of hands and sending somebody out to do a job. The word apostle in Greek just means sent. So you can use it in a strict sense, a technical sense, or in a more expansive sense. So, technically, yes. So Luke talks about sending out 70 disciples. He doesn't use the word apostle. And so, this is a semantic thing. Sorry, I was confusing. Probably should have just said disciples. But, there you go.
All good. Bob, thanks so much for your call from Long Island today. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Question now from Leslie, checking in on YouTube. Leslie says, did Pope Benedict end the dispensation for a fallaway Catholic to marry outside the church? My 7 grown kids are arguing about it.
Yes, this question is very near and dear to my heart because it affects me directly.
Okay.
Right? So in the 1983 Code of Canon Law that was promulgated by Pope John Paul II, there was a provision that allowed for Catholics to renounce their faith and to no longer be Catholic for purposes of canon law, such that the church would no longer regard them as subject to the jurisdiction of the church or to the laws of the church.
All right.
Okay, and if that's the case, then someone who has renounced their Catholic faith and is no longer Catholic, but is still a Christian, could contract a marriage outside the church that the Catholic Church would regard as valid if they were subsequently to come back.
Okay.
Because at the time of that wedding, they were not, in fact, Catholic under the law of 1983. And therefore their marriage would be valid. Now, if a Catholic tries to marry outside the church, his marriage is invalid because as a Catholic, he's bound by the canonical form of marriage. A non-Catholic is not so bound, and that would include an ex-Catholic who had renounced his faith. But this posed a difficulty because there were jurisdictions in the world. This had less to do with our sort of Western issues of marriage, but there were jurisdictions in the world where the ability to renounce one's faith led Catholics to be pressured by non-Catholic family members and relatives to renounce their Catholic faith. And so it was actually being used as an excuse for people to renounce their faith that might otherwise not have done so. And so Pope Benedict removed that provision of the law, and he went back to the older system of once a Catholic, always a Catholic. Now, how does this affect people marrying outside the church in the West? Okay, and why do I care? I grew up non-Catholic. I thought the Catholic Church was a terrible thing, and I had no interest in Catholicism and certainly wasn't going to obey Catholic canon law. My wife, however, my current wife, my only wife, the only one I've ever had, grew up a Catholic, but was an atheist. So she was an atheist at the time of her confirmation. Now, in case you're wondering, the church says you don't have to repeat confirmation if you received it as an atheist, because this is one of the sacraments that revives. It was validly received by her, but of course not efficaciously received by her.
Right.
But as soon as she has faith and repentance, then the grace of that sacrament revives. And so its validity is not in question, right?
Okay.
But she was actually an atheist when she was confirmed. And so needless to say, she didn't give a fig about the Catholic Church. And after confirmation, she never went back to Mass ever. And when I met her, she was not practicing anything. But I got her to go with me to the Presbyterian Church. And it kind of caught, and she became a sincere Protestant. And so we both were enthusiastically married in the Protestant Church and didn't cross our minds, didn't care what the Catholic Church thought about it because we didn't think much of the Catholic Church, right? So we were married in the Protestant Church. I become Catholic. That was 1992 I got married. 2003, I become Catholic. And when I go to knock on the door of the church and tell the priest that I'm interested in becoming Catholic, he asked me a bunch of questions, and one of them is, well, tell me about your marriage. So I laid this situation out to him, and he said to me, so your wife left the Catholic Church? I said, yes. He said, she renounced her faith? I said, well, I mean, she went to a Protestant church. He said, he received the sacraments in a Protestant church? I said, yes. He says, okay, well, that's tantamount to renouncing her Catholic faith. So for canonical purposes, you're validly married because she wasn't actually Catholic at the time. That was 2003. Oh, I think about 2008, my wife actually asks a canon lawyer in our diocese, was I validly married? And he says, oh, no, absolutely invalid, because to renounce your faith requires a more detailed process of actually sort of like formally declaring this in front of a bishop or writing a letter to the bishop, that sort of thing. You didn't do that, so you were still Catholic, so your marriage is invalid.
Wow.
So then I'm in a tizzy here, right? So I go to another canonist who I really respected, and I said, okay, Father, priest number 1 said this. He says, oh, that's correct. But then priest number 2 said that. That's correct. Well, wait a minute, Father. Did you not hear that they said opposite things, right? And I said to myself, there is an ambiguity in the law here, right? And it's going to lead to these kind of confusions. So what we did was we said, you know what? The safest course of action is to convalidate our wedding. So to this day, I don't know if that first marriage was considered valid or not, but I had a good canonist tell me it wasn't. But there was enough ambiguity that I said, just going to convalidate. We convalidated that. Now I'm validly married in the Catholic Church. That's not in question. And Pope Benedict removed that loophole so that no one else will have that confusion ever again.
What a nice guy.
Well, unless some subsequent pope changes it back.
What a great story, though. Thanks so much for it, and thanks so much for your email. Here's one now from John regarding the line in the Our Father, lead us not into temptation. Doesn't it imply he is leading us to a trial for our own sanctification? I've also heard in the liturgy, quote, spare us from the last trials instead. Is this accurate?
So you may remember a few years ago, there was a kind of brouhaha in certain dioceses around the world of bishops' conferences that wanted to change the language in the vernacular to say, don't let us fall into temptation. They didn't like that lead us into temptation business. And I said, first of all, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of changing the words of Christ. I don't like that idea. But I'm going to dig in here and look a little bit closer. So I did two things. One of the things I did is I went and got into the Greek, and I looked up the word that's being used for lead here. And it's the same Greek verb, if memory serves me correct, that is used of the men who lower the paralytic down to Jesus. Right?
Really?
Yeah. So they brought him into Christ's presence in a very active sense, right?
Yeah.
And that's the same Greek word, right? Or it's at least a cognate of it. So that we're talking about don't bring me directly and deliberately into the presence of temptation, right? So I thought that's pretty strong language right there. Then I got into the Fathers and the Doctors of the Church to read their commentaries. Does God ever lead us into temptation? And here's what I found in St. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas says, absolutely yes, God leads us into temptation. 100% he does. He doesn't tempt us directly, but he does lead us into occasions of temptation. Thomas gives 3 reasons why. Let's see if I can remember them all. Number 1, as an occasion of merit.
Okay.
You remember one time I went to confession to a priest, and I said, Father, I'm really struggling with this temptation. He said, well, have you done it? I said, no. He says, oh, well, then it's occasion of merit. You're actually a better person for having been tempted and resisting. Right? So it's an occasion of merit.
Okay.
Another reason would be, as a test of our virtue. So in Catholic theology and moral theology, you distinguish the continent man from the temperate man. So an incontinent man is one who gives in to all his passions. A continent man is one who doesn't give in to his passions, but it's difficult. And a temperate man is one who doesn't give in to his passions, and he does so easily. And, it's possible, let's say, you have a compulsion or a habitual sin, and you haven't done it for a while, and you think, I got that thing licked, right? But the issue is you just haven't been faced with the temptation. Then you face that temptation, and whoof, you're right, back off the wagon again. Oh, I guess I wasn't as strong as I thought I was, right? So as a test of your virtue is an opportunity to strengthen your act of virtue. And the third reason is very interesting. The third reason is as chastisement for sin. Sin being its own punishment.
Wow.
Right? And St. Paul suggests that in Romans chapter 1, that sometimes God gives people up to their passions so that they will suffer the consequence of their deeds. So those are 3 reasons that he doesn't tempt us directly. James says God doesn't cause anyone to sin, right? But that he would bring us into the occasion of temptation to accomplish some purpose for our own salvation or sanctification.
John, thanks so much for your email. We could not get to Joe watching us on YouTube. Joe, we're going to carry that question of yours over to our next program. Dr. David Anders, thank you,
Thanks,
sir.
Tom.
Don't forget, we do this program Monday through Friday on EWTN Radio at 2 p.m. Eastern. On behalf of our fantastic team, I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders. Thanks for joining us today. Be sure and check out the podcast. It's available at EWTN's Podcast Central. Have a great day, and God bless.
Hi, I'm Doug Keck, inviting you to join me next time when our special guest